The next two lessons are all about the XBRL files and the content, including the validation process with the auditors and also with the regulators as well. Lesson 5 here particularly focuses on the content validation. And basically what you're doing is the aim is to identify potential issues early, particularly around the structure of the file. So I think we have a couple of examples here, but do you want to explain what the content validation is and how the process works, Bartek? I think that is probably useful for people as well.
Sure. We kind of divide validation procedures into content and technical, and we'll speak about technical in lesson 6. Content validation means validation of the numbers as well as validation of the structure in terms of parent-child relationships, calculations, things like that. And it's a very important piece of not only the XBRL file itself, but also of the financial statements, because the XBRL after tagging will allow you to run calculations on your financials. And maybe something does not calculate. Maybe there are some roundings that make the financials not calculate exactly. And we have a couple of examples here. The first one is exactly what I've been saying, calculation. And you can see, if you look in detail in the text, you can see that those calculations are off by 1. Meaning it's probably rounding. Probably some of the numbers were rounded because they were expressed in thousands, and then those rounding did not add up exactly. And the paper obviously takes it, as it is. But XBRL will flag it up and will issue a warning. And one very important thing I have to say here is these content validation procedures, they usually end up with a warning. And those warnings are supposed to make you take a second look at your numbers, at your structure, analyze it again, and make sure it's correct. It might be that you get a warning and still everything is correct. Maybe you are accepting the rounding error and you're fine with it. And that is okay. Those filings are going to be accepted, are valid XBRL filings. However, XBRL just flags up some inconsistencies. Same thing happened for the next example when we have the formula validations, which validate whether the numbers should be positive and maybe are reported negatively or the other way around. And here, the bottom example is the termination benefits expense. When we had the discussion with the client, because the termination benefits expense they reported was negative, it made them take a second look and they analyzed it and they realized that they actually had a correction of the termination benefits expense from prior year that resulted in a credit value, so a reversal of the expense. And the negative number was correct. So a validation isn't supposed to make them just change the number, go with the positive value instead of a negative value, but it's supposed to make them think and make you think again whether your values are correct.
And I think we got asked this on the previous discussion that we had about this was, can you still submit when you've got some validation errors in terms of the process? And like you say, you can do that, but ultimately what we're saying is that XBRL will help with that validation. It will provide warnings, which then will allow you to make a decision to adjust the data and update accordingly, depending on what the warning is, correct?
Of course, and as I said, you might not want to, you might decide that there is no update needed, and that should be fine. I believe those filings will be accepted. But also you can think about it from the user perspective. If you have those calculation warnings, even if they are roundings, you kind of lose trust in your financials. If your face financials don't calculate, the user will know. And then they might lose some trust in the rest of the financials, knowing that you are making some shortcuts in your financials. So if you are not doing the XBRL after your financials are fully ready and unchangeable, which I always advise against, do your XBRL a bit earlier, run those validations and see what they come up with. Maybe you're going to make the change in your original financials based on that.
And that's the key thing about it, is that XBRL just helps with that process of just calculating. It just makes it more accurate, basically. That's what it's doing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And then obviously the second part, which is lesson 6, is the validation for the technical aspect of the file. And obviously this part is to identify the technical issues. And the aim of this will be to work with your service provider on correcting the technical validation procedures. Now, again, we've got an example of the technical warnings and validation procedure that you get back. And I know you're not a technical expert, but could you explain what issuers are going to see based on those warnings and what they need to do basically at that point?
Yeah, so unlike the content validation procedures, the technical validations usually end with errors, kind of hard errors that should be corrected for XBRL to be fully valid and acceptable. And my thinking is the regulators might disallow filings that have those errors in the future. As you said, Danny, I'm not IT, so I don't want to get into the technical details of those validation reports. But the point is that you should be working in a system or with a service provider that makes sure that those warnings do not appear. Good software should eliminate those warnings, as well as a good service provider should talk to you if the warning is a result of something that you might have incorrectly in your financials. And you should be able to eliminate those errors from your filing.
And obviously, continuing lesson 6, what we discovered that ultimately lesson 5 and lesson 6, you're going to run through a validation loop. Now, you can see on the screen here that you've got obviously the participants, that there's the issuers, the auditors, the service providers. That will go through into preparing your file. You'll then obviously go through the analysis and the discussion of what your file is, and then you'll push it through to the validation point. That validation will obviously give you results back on that. And at that point, you will then adjust and correct, and then probably go through the process again of analyzing and discussing exactly what you need to do to just update it. And it kind of just goes around that in terms of that loop until eventually you get to the point where the validation is acceptable to what you want from an issuer's point of view, and then you could submit that as a filing point as well. And the aim of the workflow is to lead to continual feedback and discussion and testing as well. Bartek, any comments on that kind of validation loop?
Yeah, I think the loop is the most important word here. You should be working in a loop. So, whenever you have those errors or validation warnings, you should take a look at them, then adjust and go back. And as we said at the beginning, it might even mean that you will adjust your original financials. Why not? If you still have time, if you're still in the right moment in the process to be able to make those changes to the financials, it might happen. We've had cases like that as well. My advice would be, leave enough time so that you can actually work that loop, that you have enough time to validate and then adjust and then go again.
And time is a critical point, isn't it? Because there could be subsequent reviews that you have to adjust it, and that's that time that's the critical point, particularly at the end of it. Yeah,
absolutely. In particular, if you have the auditors involved, which most likely you will, there's yourselves, there's the auditors, there's the service providers, so many parties involved in that loop that you have to time it wisely.